In Module 9, we covered social psychology, which tries to explain behavior primarily by looking to forces in the situation. In Module 10, we turn our attention to personality psychology, which looks to internal person-level variables to explain people's responses. In the previous module, we saw how social forces in the situation, such as the commanding presence of an authority figure or the pressure we feel to fit in and conform with others, can influence how we respond. But situational forces by themselves are not sufficient to explain the rich complexity of human behavior. After all, some people respond very differently, even in the same situation, like this mom and her son in this photograph. In traffic, some people hold their cool and remain patient, whereas others lay on their car horn and become quite agitated. Some people appear to be super responsible. They have their schoolwork done a whole week in advance, and you never have to worry about them being late for an appointment. Others are the ones to whom you say that an event starts an hour earlier than it actually does, so that by the time the person inevitably shows up an hour late by their own reckoning, they're actually on time for the event. In other words, people are different, and it's studying these differences that is the focus of personality psychology. For this reason, personality psychology is also sometimes referred to as the study of individual differences. Specifically, personality is defined as a person's characteristic way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. This means that it is the typical way that someone responds across time and across situations. If someone is generally grumpy, regardless of if they are stuck in traffic or relaxing on the beach, then we would say that this is part of his or her personality, not just a response to the immediate situation. On the flip side, if someone suddenly gets upset at their roommate, but is otherwise generally cool and level-headed, then we might conclude the sudden outburst was more so the result of situational factors rather than being a personality trait. So then, a cornerstone of personality psychology is identifying and studying stable individual differences. In order to do so, scientists need a way to measure these individual differences accurately, and this is trickier than you might think. A common way for scientists to assess personality is with self-report measures. That is, we can ask you questions about how you typically think, feel, and behave. A benefit of self-report measures is that they're very easy data to collect. Self-report measures tend to be relatively quick and easy for people to fill out, and they're also usually straightforward for the researcher to analyze. However, an obvious concern is in regards to their accuracy. Are people being honest on these kinds of assessments? It's very uncommon for people to outright lie on a self-report measure, but people do sometimes fudge their answers a little bit in a more socially desirable direction. Nobody wants to openly admit to being a jerk, after all. Moreover, people often have less insight into their own behavior than you might think, especially when it comes to understanding our faults. We're motivated to see and believe in the best version of ourselves, so we're often somewhat unaware of our own shortcomings, although they may be more obvious to others. This concern can be partially addressed with informant report measures. In an informant report, we ask a person's friends, family members, colleagues, or acquaintances to give information about the target participant. So, who knows us best? Ourselves or others? On the one hand, other people certainly don't know us perfectly. First, the contexts in which other people see us are necessarily going to be limited. Our colleagues might only see us at work, for example, whereas our family members might only see us at home. Secondly, no one but ourselves has access to our most private inner thoughts and feelings. However, there's some indication that at least in certain areas, other people might know us a little bit better than we do ourselves. In one study looking at this, researchers obtained both self and informant reports of people's personality using the Big 5 personality traits, which we'll cover more in the last video. The researchers then tracked participants over time and looked to see who lived and who died. The researchers found that for some personality traits, it was actually the informant report that did a better job of predicting mortality. So, at least in some respects, your friends may actually know you better than you know yourself. Finally, researchers might try and examine people's actual behavioral responses, not just what they say they think or do. If someone says they're usually responsible, well, are they? Do they maintain a good GPA? Do they have good credit? And is their living space generally tidy and clean? One personality psychologist named Sam Gosling has done some pretty interesting research that uses these kinds of behavioral measures. Specifically, he looks at how people's personality shows up in the behavioral traces they leave behind in their physical spaces, such as offices or dorm rooms. For a fun video of Sam analyzing people's office spaces on the Dr. Phil Show, you can check out the supplemental video on Canvas. Behavioral measures are considered the gold standard of measurement in psychology. However, they're also generally much harder to obtain. Filling out a self-report questionnaire might only take 5 or 10 minutes, but it takes a lot of time and effort to go and physically observe someone's behavior, such as checking out their dorm room, for example. For this reason, most personality researchers rely on self-report data. However, although self-report measures can be susceptible to bias, many self-report measures of personality have been shown to be accurate and reliable. In order to validate a self-report scale, researchers need to collect data and demonstrate 2 things. First, researchers need to show that the scale is reliable, that is, that it gives consistent results. Personality is not the same thing as mood. Remember, personality is your enduring, typical way of responding, so it should be pretty stable over time. In other words, if you take the same personality test 6 months apart, your score should be consistent. It shouldn't change all that much. If people's scores change a lot on a personality test from time 1 to time 2, then that's an indication there might be something wrong with the test. However, just because a scale gives consistent results doesn't necessarily mean it's also accurate. Imagine an archer shooting at a target like the picture on this slide. The archer is being consistent, that is, all 3 of his arrows are consistently hitting the same spot. However, he's also consistently off, that is, he's not hitting the center target at all. In the same way, a psychological measure can give results that are generally consistent, but also consistently wrong or inaccurate to some degree. This is where the concept of validity comes in. Whereas reliability looks at consistency, validity is concerned with accuracy. Is the scale measuring accurately what it says it is? Reliability is necessary for validity, but not sufficient. In order to judge whether or not a scale is in fact valid, researchers often need to look to some kind of objective outside criterion. For example, if I want to develop a new self-report measure of relationship quality, I could look to see if it actually predicts how long couples stay together. If it did, this would be a good indicator that my self-report measure of relationship quality is accurate and trustworthy. Or imagine I developed a self-report measure of how conscientious and reliable people are. I could then have people come into the lab and see if their responses on the self-report measure accurately predict whether they actually show up on time for the experiment. Once the scale has been validated, we can feel confident using it over and over again with other samples. As I mentioned earlier, there are some accurate personality assessments, and we'll talk more about one of these in the final video when we discuss the Big Five. However, unfortunately, there are also many personality assessments that are not accurate. We all know that the silly BuzzFeed quizzes about which Marvel character you are just for fun and are not meant to be taken seriously. However, there are some personality assessments that claim to be serious and accurate, such as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator or its modern incarnation, 16 Personalities. What about results from these kinds of tests? If you've ever taken one of these tests, you might have thought it was accurate because the description felt right on the money. But is that a good indication of a scale's validity? Actually, it's not, and the reason is because of something called the Barnum effect. The Barnum effect is the tendency for people to easily believe vague, generally positive statements about themselves. For example, imagine that after taking a personality test, you got the following feedback about yourself. Your score indicates that for you, success doesn't come from money or status, but from seeking fulfillment, helping others, and being a force for good in the world. If you got a result like this, would you believe that the test had been accurate? In fact, this description comes directly from the 16 Personalities website and is supposedly a mark of the INFJ personality type. According to 16 Personalities, INFJs are supposed to be one of the rarest personality types. Yet my guess is that most of you probably resonated with that description to some degree. This is because wanting to seek fulfillment and help others is a characteristic that describes most human beings in general, not just some people with certain personality types. It's often possible for results from a personality test to feel very accurate, not because the test is a good one, but simply because the results are phrased so as to be general enough that most people can easily see themselves in the description. For this reason, it's important to be careful when reading about personality descriptions from online personality tests. Despite their popularity, pretty much all of these tests are actually no better than the silly BuzzFeed quizzes about which Marvel character you are or which ice cream flavor fits you best. That's why it's important to rely on personality measures that have been developed by scientists and have been empirically shown to be both reliable and valid. For an interesting video that shows the power of the Barnum effect, you can check out the supplemental video on Canvas. Just like social psychology, personality psychology isn't just one thing. Human beings and their personalities are especially complex and multifaceted. This means that any one particular theory or idea of personality is inevitably going to fall short to some degree. Instead, personality psychology is comprised of several different perspectives, each emphasizing a different aspect of personality. If you take Psych 2054 on personality psychology, you'll learn more about each of these different perspectives. For now, I'm just going to focus on 2 perspectives. First, in the next video, I'll cover Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic perspective. Although much of Freud's theory has been debunked, many of his ideas have survived in the popular consciousness, and he did lay much of the groundwork for more modern approaches that we use today. Finally, in the last video, I'll cover one of the most popular and well-supported of these modern approaches, the Big Five, which is part of the trait perspective. In this video, I give an overview of the subfield of personality psychology. For the exam, you should be able to define personality, describe how personality psychology differs from social psychology, describe the different methods personality researchers might use to measure personality, such as self-report, informant report, and behavioral measures, and discuss some of the benefits and drawbacks of each, define and distinguish between reliability and validity and describe how each can be assessed by a researcher, and define the Barnum effect and discuss why it can make it difficult to discern a personality test's accuracy.